Welcome to Standard Theory. My name is Damon. In the last couple videos, we introduced the Standard Behavioral Index. We did kind of an overview of it, and after that, we got more in depth and talked about all the individual components. We talked about the Z0 scale and the components of impulse. We talked about the R scale and the faculty of intelligence. Then we talked about the Z scale and the faculty of post-intelligence. Then we went through all those in standard and non-standard way. Then we mentioned complex communication, and we also mentioned the dark scale and cyclic thinking or memory. So those gave us the rules that we needed to address essentially anything that we need to in psychology and the brain and behavior and so forth. So in this video, I'd like to kind of work backwards before we move any further through standard theory. And I'd like to sort of discuss how we can apply this to the things that have already been done in psychology. And I kind of just want to do an overview of that and talk about some of the main theories that exist in psychology and kind of explain how we can parallel those kind of schools of thought to what standard theory is saying. So there are a few primary schools of thought in psychology. Those are the ones that are most popular and have been around for kind of enough time that they've been taught and put into textbooks and so on. So I'll just go ahead and start listing those, and we can discuss how those sort of parallel, or sort of how standard theory addresses those different viewpoints. So the first one that we'll talk about is behaviorism. And then there's also psychodynamics. And then we have humanism or humanistic. And then we have the biologic. And then we have social learning, which I consider to be very important. And then finally we have kind of the emergent theories, and also mention cognitive behavioral theory, or CBT, and also the emergent theories. So each one of these are kind of their own kind of area, or own school of thought. These are kind of like the pillars that people use to approach or address different things when it comes to behavior and the brain and emotions and all kinds of different things when you think about psychology. And what we want to see is if there's a way that we can use our set of rules in standard theory to address what's going on in each one of these. And one thing about standard theory is that we don't want to try to be really verbose or really kind of long-winded about what we're talking about. We really want to say this is exactly what this thing is. You know, we don't want to have to do a lot of guessing and conjecture and stuff. So what I'll go ahead and do is just write down which aspect of standard theory applies to each one of these, and hopefully we'll be able to see how this one set of rules applies to all these different things. And only certain aspects of standard theory are going to address these, and that's sort of the whole point, is we want standard theory to be our unification or our all-in-one or kind of universal singular explanation of all this stuff. And really quickly, you should be able to see how these contribute to what standard theory is saying, and hopefully we'll be able to see how standard theory organizes each one of these. So I'll go ahead and just write the parts of standard theory that apply to these. So with behaviorism, the two things that we really need to address that are going to be the Z0 scale. We have space to write this, but we need the Z0 scale and we need cyclic thinking. And with those, we can essentially describe all of behaviorism, and we can discuss kind of how that works. With psychodynamics, we really just need the R scale to describe what's going on. And there are different areas of psychodynamics, but basically the entire idea that the psychodynamics is based on can be described by the R scale. And with the humanistic ideas, we just need a few of our assertions. Which are, there are about half a dozen of them, and those assertions talk about the goal of psychology and the goal of communicating with people, and it talks about constructive versus destructive tendencies and so on, but that's kind of all we need for that. Biologic, we really need the entire index for the biologic sort of thing, so we're just going to say that it's sort of integrated into the behavioral index. And we can discuss how each one of those sort of correlates to the different areas and the different kind of anatomical structures of the brain. We can talk about how metabolism is involved in that, and we can talk about how neurochemistry is involved in it. And we can also look at things like how medications and so forth kind of become involved in that. So with social learning, the only thing that we really need to look at are the different communication and thinking types. There are really only two or three primary social learning things that I want to talk about. So the only thing we need again to describe that is the R scale. So most of that is going to be part of learning from one another. In the R scale, it's kind of what social learning is about learning from other people and so on. And for cognitive behavioral theory, the only thing we need to be able to understand is how to get to the Z scale. So the Z scale is going to give us what we need to discuss cognitive behavior theory, and that includes all the steps that are required to get to the Z scale. So going through the Z0 scale, going through the R scale and the gap, and then finally into the Z scale. That's where the sort of that process is sort of what cognitive behavior theory is explaining. And for emergent theories, the only thing we need is to be able to understand the behavioral index. So if we know what standard theory is saying, we can compare these emergent theories to standard theory the same way that the emergent theories can be a branch or sort of a continuation or interpretation of these other things. We can use standard theory to compare and contrast the capabilities of those theories. And some of them are something like the biopsychosocial model. There are personality theories. There are more specialized things like feminism and narrative kind of approaches to psychology. But we really have to compare and contrast at that point, because they're either going to be some adaptation of one of these other ones, or it's going to be some continuation of one of these things. So if we have another tool to use to compare those and contrast those, then it makes it very easy to see what the limitations of those other theories are, what the strengths and weaknesses of those things are. And technically, standard theory is one of the emergent theories. It doesn't really fall into one of these primary categories. It really is kind of an emergent theory. So if you had to categorize standard theory based on this, you would categorize it as an emergent theory. So the thing about the emergent theories is it takes some effort in putting the kind of work behind it, the same kind of work that all these other things have been doing. So what we can do is just talk about each one of these specifically, just to kind of cover them and just give a little bit of explanation of them. But in reality, these are all we need to describe each one of these traditional kind of classical theories. So we can go ahead and just discuss these very quickly. Behaviorism, the whole thing about behaviorism is observing what happens when you do something to a subject. So it's kind of like shaking the cage and seeing what happens after that. And the primary thing that we see in behaviorism are the ideas of stimuli or some kind of stimulation like shaking the cage, and then some kind of result from that. So whatever behavior tends to occur after you cause that stimulation to happen. And if you think back to the Z0 scale, the whole process of that is essentially describing how any given subject or individual deals with information from the environment. And that's kind of the parallel to behaviorism, is that we're seeing what kind of environmental control we can sort of institute or place on that individual, or that subject, and then view what happens to them after that. So we need the Z0 scale just to observe how the individual or how the subject goes through handling that information. And behaviorism doesn't necessarily follow the same set of rules as standard theory does, but standard theory has a language to describe behaviorism. So in behaviorism, there's the unconditioned stimulus, and then there's an unconditioned response, and that's sort of the raw environmental kind of experience. And in standard theory, we have the impulse, which means that the subject or individual has recognized that there's some stimulation going on in their environment, and then that leads to subtraction, where they try to figure out something about that information, and then following that, they display some kind of response. At least in behaviorism, that's what you expect to have happen. And that response or that behavior, which it may not always be a behavior, it's much, I believe it's much easier to see that in animals and things. I think sometimes people will have their own way to deal with it, especially if they've been through the scale of intelligence or something like that. But with animals, it's very easy to see, because most of what they are displaying is going to be a behavioral response that's really kind of hardwired into their need for survival. And we've also proven that it doesn't necessarily have to be survival based, but in order to do that, we have to condition them to do it. So along with the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response, there's also the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response. And to address those, we have to assume that the subject or individual is familiar with those things, and they recognize that they have been exposed to that previously. And to explain that, we need to be able to understand memory, and that's kind of cyclic thinking. So we can address the unconditioned version of things just using the Z0 scale, which is raw experience, and we can learn people's tendencies and how they tend to respond to things. But once we start controlling that stuff, once we repeatedly expose them to that information, and once we try to condition something out of them, or try to make it more likely for them to do something, or force them to display a specific response or specific behavior, we have to take memory into account, because we kind of assume that they have some previous experience that influences that conditioned stimulus or that conditioned response. So that's kind of like the primary aspect of behaviorism, is just kind of shaking the cage and seeing what happens. So to address basically all of kind of pure behaviorism, like the classical behaviorism, that's all we really need to do. And that includes conditioning and classical conditioning and all that kind of stuff. So moving on, we can also address psychodynamics. And there are three primary branches of psychodynamics. There's sort of the fundamental psychodynamics, there's psychoanalytics, then there's kind of the psychosocial kind of version of things. And they all build on one another, and they all start at the same place. And the primary part of psychodynamics is explaining what is observed when you deal with people and their internalizations. Behaviorism is all about kind of the externalized world and what happens based on the environment, and psychodynamics is all the internal world and how people interpret who they are as an individual, how they deal with themselves, and so on. And psychodynamics has a few really important things to consider, and one of the most important things that psychodynamics talks about are the different levels of people's thought processes. And in psychodynamics, it's referred to as the id, the ego, and the superego. It's also called unconscious, conscious, and superconscious, or subconscious, conscious, and superconscious, and so on. But that's one of the most important things that psychodynamics offers to standard theory. And if you try to parallel them, you see really quickly that we have all these different types of thinking and all these different types of communication. And that's essentially what psychodynamics was based on, in terms of observing people and communicating with them and talking to them one-on-one. So in the original psychodynamics, the other thing that is really important, and also in psychoanalytics, is the idea that people can only express themselves up to a certain point. And at some point that kind of breaks down. That's something that a couple of the primary figures of psychodynamics talked about. And once that process of self-expression breaks down, there's some problem in continuing that. They kind of become limited. And there are other factors, which psychodynamics refers to as unconscious factors. You can think of them as hang-ups or something like that. But there's something that gets in the way of that self-expression. And that's the kind of process that we see in some of the communication types of standard theory. So if you read into psychodynamics or psychoanalytics, the process of people expressing themselves to a certain point and then having to sort of back away from that, and then having to do or display some other thing, some other behavior, some other process, that's sort of the thing that's explained in the R scale. Once you get to that point, you have to figure out what you observe. And that's what most of psychodynamics is based on. This is kind of the abnormal part of things. So people talking about the dreams and their relationships with your mother and all the other issues that prevent people from expressing themselves, that becomes sort of an exploration into the abnormal version of psychodynamics. So at that point, we just look at the non-standard version of the R scale, and that gives us what we need to see in the psychosexual stages, and that sort of explains why dreams are so important. They're supposed to be interpretations of what's causing, or I'm sorry, what's preventing the self-expression, and so on. So most of what psychodynamics is about isn't necessarily describing how people are thinking, but it's describing why they lack normal processing. And psychodynamics explains that that normal processing should be some expression of the ego or some expression of the self, and at some point that becomes impossible, and people resort to other kind of behaviors, or they're limited in some way. So another branch of psychodynamics is psychoanalytics, which can be very complicated if you just read what is out there on it. But the whole process of psychoanalytics deals with expressing those conscious factors and that self-expression, but in a social kind of realm. So the language that we need to describe psychoanalytics is actually supersocial communication, and each one of these could probably be their own video on that. But psychoanalytics has something to do with like the ego, and then the shadow, and the anima, or something like that. And if we just want to parallel it directly to standard theory, the thing that we're seeing is a supersocial interaction. So what is being observed in that aspect, the kind of that primary part of psychoanalytics, is how a person goes about expressing themselves, which is what standard theory calls displaying a directive in a supersocial kind of way, or expressing a deferral in a supersocial kind of way. So that's essentially the entirety of what psychodynamics is kind of touching on. And it was kind of carried out to the point where you can organize people's display of directive or deferral or ego or shadow in a social setting. And there are all kinds of patterns and stuff like that that goes along with it. But if psychoanalytics seems confusing, the only thing you really need to think of is the supersocial interaction and whether or not a person is more apt to display a directive or a deferral. So that gives us what we need for psychodynamics. And the psychosocial theory, we kind of need the entirety of the R scale, and it's essentially all of the standard versions of things, versus a non-standard version of things. And people's tendency to deal with one or the other is sort of the struggle that they go through throughout their lifetime. So some people tend to fulfill themselves through that self-expression, and that's kind of the conscious factor that goes in the struggles associated with the psychosocial kind of explanations. And then there's the abnormal side of things, where people actually struggle with that abnormal side of things rather than expressing themselves. And those, according to psychosocial theory, will change over the lifespan, and it changes depending on whether or not you're able to overcome that struggle. So all those different aspects of psychodynamics and psychoanalytics and psychosocial kind of theories, all those are just essentially the R scale, and they're focused on the abnormal side of things. It's not until psychosocial we really see a good mixture of both. So that's essentially all we need to address what psychodynamics is talking about. So next we have the humanistic kind of paradigm. There are a few different areas to humanistic psychology as well, and those are related to human nature, things like the meaning of life and sort of the limitations of mortality, and focusing on fulfillment and that kind of thing. So when we think about those tendencies, the thing that standard theory uses to address that, or people's, the thing that we use to address that and people's tendencies are the assertions that are made. So if you remember back to the other videos, the assertions that we have deal with communication and behavior kind of being related and influencing one another. We talk about a cycle of communication or some resolution of the experience that a person has. And then we have constructive versus destructive tendencies. We have limits to what we're able to do. We have the idea that there is some kind of standard, and that anything that deviates from that is considered abnormal. And then finally we have the goal of this whole process, which is to experience that self-expression. So several aspects of the humanistic paradigm deal with that self-expression and how people can achieve that in light of social problems, how they can achieve that in light of relationships, and overcome their oppression, and to deal with their own problems in order to achieve that sense of fulfillment. And standard theory defines that sort of fulfillment as the goal of communication, which is to kind of express yourself. So that's kind of the primary thing that we need to do that. And humanistic is much more about just the nature of things. It's not really deterministic, like, A plus B equals C, or this happens because of that. It's all about getting people to experience that on their own, and trying to empower them and show them how they can go about making those experiences in light of all that other stuff, in light of all those other facets of human nature, in light of mortality and all that stuff. That's kind of what the humanistic side of things are about. And it doesn't really focus on the negative per se. It focuses on getting people to be better and to kind of improve how they think of their how they think of their life and their outlook and so on. So that gives us the language that we need to address the humanistic kind of paradigm. So we also have biologic explanations, and these are all based on like physical stuff. So this is based on like the structure of the brain that causes the phenomenon. It's based on the neurochemistry. It's based on metabolism. It's all very much based on physical, kind of scientifically observable things that we can 100% say. We can measure how much is there. We know exactly what's going on. We know that there are structures involved. We know all this stuff because we can use sort of like the hard sciences to deal with them. We can measure the levels of metabolism. We can measure stuff that's going on in the blood. We can observe and see the different structure of the brain and so forth. But that encompasses the entirety of the behavioral index, and there are three main areas that are very easy to kind of parallel to standard theory. And one of them is the anatomy, kind of like the functional anatomy, the structure of the brain. And if we think about how standard theory is organized, we think about it being the most simple version of things, which is kind of the components of impulse, and then we get a little bit more complex and a little more complex. And if we think about the brain, we can try to organize how we choose which structure to go to in a kind of progressive manner based on the most primitive or the most simple parts of the brain all the way to the most complex. So there are only a few main areas of the brain with lots of substructures underneath. And essentially we start at the hindbrain or the brainstem, we go to the midbrain, and then we kind of have the lobes that kind of cover the midbrain all the way to our most advanced, kind of going from kind of the base all the way kind of building in height all the way to the most advanced areas of the brain, which are kind of the frontal cortex and that area. And we can parallel those structures of the brain to what we're seeing in standard theory. And it could be its own whole entire video, but essentially we know that the whole process that describes intelligence, where we take an idea, we reactivate it, we take another idea, reactivate it, and we make a connection between those. We know now that that's handled by the hippocampus, which is an area that's sort of part of the midbrain. And we can think of anything that is sort of more primal, more primitive, kind of lower in height than that. We can think of that as being related to the raw experience. So those things that are kind of plugged into the brain, like the hearing, the sight, the touch, all that stuff, we can think of that as just gaining information. And then once we get to the point where we go to the more complex area, to the hippocampus, we can think that we get to the faculty of intelligence, and we can follow the faculty of intelligence all the way around through the rest of the brain, kind of the lobes and all that stuff. And then we hit the gap where those lobes kind of become, the access to those become kind of limited. And then we're back to the Z scale, which in theory goes all the way back to the hippocampus. And we kind of focus on those more primal structures and survival, rather than using the entirety of what the brain is capable of doing. So there are some other things in the midbrain that are kind of processing centers, like our language centers and how we process hormones and how we deal with memory, and all those, in theory, are involved in the Z scale. So in that way, we can kind of organize the structure of the brain and parallel them to the things that we see in standard theory. And that's kind of how we can look at it from an anatomical standpoint. The other thing in the biologic sort of paradigm that we can look at is metabolism. And that is probably its own video as well, but we have the idea that there are prerequisites to accessing intelligence, and we understand that without that level of metabolism in place, then we are sort of limited to what we're able to do in the scale of intelligence and so on. But in an interpretation of standard theory, what we look at are the fuels that the brain uses in order to facilitate those things, and there are only a few primary fuels. They're essentially the metabolites of the rest of the body, and once that metabolite has been achieved, it's sort of sent to the brain, and that's sort of part of the neurochemistry and so on. But those metabolites signal to the brain that those nutrients are available. And that way the body and the brain aren't necessarily fighting over them. It's just the body's way of signaling that those are available to the brain. And the primary fuels that the brain uses are salts for kind of fluid balance and signaling, mostly signaling, but also we have the metabolites of fat, which is acetone. That's kind of the terminal metabolite. That's kind of what people are talking about when they talk about keto diet and ketosis. That signals to the brain that there is that energy source available. And then finally, we have the metabolites of proteins, or certain proteins that help us deal with neurochemistry. So that whole thing is something that we can organize, and we can look at which character, we can go all the way to the point where we look at which characteristics are influenced by which metabolite. And those are the primary fuels that the brain uses, so we can kind of go from least complex, which are kind of going to be the salts, to the most complex, which are going to be the proteins, and we can kind of organize that based on the amount of energy that they provide for the brain, and we can look at what happens when we actually kind of correlate those aspects of metabolism to what the brain is capable of doing. And that helps us explain why people will have issues with their self-interaction. That helps us explain the neurochemistry. It helps us explain the impulse, the whole faculty of impulse in the Xenot scale. And it allows us to look at where the imbalance may be happening in terms of a person's diet or what they have available to them and so forth. So that's sort of the metabolic explanation of the integration of those ideas into standard theory. And once again, it's probably its own video. It's actually kind of interesting. But we can think of an organization, instead of using like a characteristic of communication, we can say this is because sugar is available to the brain, and that's why we see that characteristic. Or we say, you know, protein is available here, the metabolite of protein is available for here, and that's why we see this phenomenon. So we can parallel the specific phenomenon to the specific fuels that are allowing that process to occur. But that's sort of integrated into into the behavioral index, and essentially we just tag each standard characteristic with its corresponding fuel, either salt, sugar, fat, or protein. And sort of transitioning from metabolism into neurochemistry, there are a few other aspects that allow us to see why these processes are organized in the way they are. And if we think back to the explanation of the R scale, you may remember, especially in the non-standard version, that self-interaction is a huge part of that. And self-interaction is the sort of gateway into experiencing increasing activation in the R scale. Even though we have all these prerequisites, even if we achieve all those prerequisites, we'll be limited by our self-interaction, which is a neurochemistry. And those are specific metabolites that are not necessarily fuel. And that's sort of what neurochemistry allows us to look at. And along with that, we can see other metabolites that influence the way that we behave and the way that we feel. And that helps us explain things like hormones and how the kind of endocrine system influences the way that we experience things, especially in the Z scale. So that also helps us kind of transition into sex and sexuality and how hormones influence our experience of that. And standard theory kind of implies that our sexuality is a mirror of this, but using some different set of prerequisites to get into the R scale. Once again, that's probably some video, but there should be some amount of hormone release, and then some re-entry into the scale of intelligence, and then some subsequent re-entry into the Z scale in order to explain how sexuality itself is facilitated, but otherwise it's almost identical to the standard behavioral index. So that allows us to see how our own metabolites and things, our own internal stimulation influences the way that we go through these things. So that gives us the anatomy, that gives us metabolism, and that also gives us the neurochemistry, things like neurotransmitters, the inhibitory molecules, excitatory molecules, and then also hormones, which there are some hormones that are involved in sex, there are some hormones that are involved in things like hunger, and some other stuff like that. So that's all integrated into standard theory. Unfortunately, it may not be as obvious as some of these other ones, but it's it's essentially part of using these rules to observe why those things happen. But it essentially gives us a set of rules to talk about how each one of those things influences the various aspects of the index. So next we have social learning, and social learning is kind of a subset of psychodynamics in all reality, but it also has aspects of the humanistic side of things and behaviorism and so on. So I think it's important to mention, and there are really only two that I would like to mention because I think they sort of support what standard theory is saying rather than standard theory trying to explain what's going on with those. And one of them is essentially called social learning theory, and it essentially says that everything that we learn from other people. And unfortunately we know that's not exactly true, but if you kind of take that stance and view everything based on that, that's kind of what that theory is trying to explain. And essentially what it's saying is that there's some dynamic between individuals that allows us to learn from one another rather than just learning from pure environmental experience. It's some kind of special case that we're learning from an individual rather than just learning or becoming familiar with whatever's in the environment. And that's explained through orthogonal thinking, essentially part of the R scale. And the other kind of social learning theory I'd like to address is the stages of cognitive development. And those describe very closely the same things that standard theory describes in terms of the different faculties. So when it comes to just getting raw environmental experience, according to that social learning, the cognitive development theory, there's a certain age range where you should develop in a way that allows you to handle that information. And then as an individual gets older, they are able to obtain new faculties, and they're able to build on that and deal with even more faculties and so on. And that theory goes a little bit deeper into the physical side of things, about being able to grip and being able to write and being able to think and solve problems. It goes all the way from that physical thing all the way up into the kind of cognitive side of things. And essentially what's being explained over that time frame is the different faculties that people have. That's kind of the concept that's explained with that. So eventually, I suppose a person should be able to master all of those different stages of development and then use them as needed to be able to do things like abstract thinking and the more advanced stuff. And if you look into the theory of cognitive development, you should see a parallel to almost everything that's in standard theory. And you should see how the faculties that are explained in cognitive development are also essentially the same faculties that are explained in standard theory. So that allows us to use the same set of rules to describe that social side of things as well. There are other social theories out there, but more or less there are some combination of these other things, and they try to figure out why they observe something based on these other kind of things. Standard theory uses the same set of rules to describe all of that. So that's sort of another way that we can look at how standard theory gives us a tool to evaluate why those different social learning theories may not all say the same thing, or why they diverge from one another and so forth. It's just kind of another way to look at those rules. But in order to address those, we just need to understand the behavioral index. So now we have cognitive behavior theory, and this is probably one of the more popular, more widely used theories out there because it adapts several of these things. And in order to do the same thing as cognitive behavior theory, we just have to understand how to get to the Z-scale. So cognitive behavior theory is about thinking about our emotions and thinking about our situations and thinking about how we feel about things in a rational way. And in doing so, we're supposed to be able to influence how we react to things and how we respond to things. And that gives us a way to sort of control how we respond and react on an individual level. So if there's an emotional kind of thing, we think, okay, I'm feeling this emotion because this is happening. Or if it's kind of a response to something, you think, the reason that I responded that way is because of this. And in doing that, the idea is that once you find yourself emotional, or once you find yourself in that situation again, you have some way to think about it. You already kind of come up with a rationalization of what it is that you've gone through. And that, in theory, is supposed to be able to control your behavior in that situation, or at least kind of have your behavior determined or under control, I should say. So if we kind of try to parallel that to standard theory, what we're trying to do is essentially take any one of the experiences that we're having, any cycle of communication, and we're trying to resolve it. And if you remember back to how we get to the Z scale, we have to go through all these steps. We have to experience a certain amount of impulse, and we have to compress that information a certain number of times. And once we do that, we have to go through all these other prerequisites. We have to be in a safe place. We have to have a certain level of metabolism. We have to ignore, we have to ignore all these social factors. We have to ignore all these other things. And then we get into intelligence. And once we get into intelligence, we have all these experiences. And we do that until we hit the gap. And once we hit the gap, all those experiences become compressed and then kind of transmuted. So once we compress and transmute that stuff, we're left with the faculty of post-intelligence. And that is what cognitive behavioral theory is trying to address, is what happens in post-intelligence. Because when you find yourself in those situations, when that emotion kind of overcomes you and so on, it makes it difficult for us to think about what's going on. We're trying to solve a problem. And if there's something that's left unresolved, or something that isn't well understood, there's a better chance that we spend more effort or kind of go through other means to try to solve that problem, and eventually that could lead to kind of a behavioral change. And that's what we want to try to address, is trying to find a way to resolve those issues so that when we get to that point, we can have some way to think about them. And it's also very similar to getting to the gap, and it's also very similar to solving those problems using those metaphysical processes. And that whole thing of navigating that system is what cognitive behavior theory is about. And there are all kinds of things. It's probably one of the most kind of scientifically studied aspects in terms of intervention when it comes to using psychology to solve a problem or to try to help somebody and so on. So understanding how standard theory navigates that whole process into the Z scale is essentially what cognitive behavior theory is trying to say, is that there's some way to resolve that issue or resolve that problem or to rationalize it before it becomes a behavioral thing. So that gives us language you need to talk about cognitive behavior theory. And when it comes to emergent theories, it really just depends on which one you want to talk about. The one that I learned about when I was in school was the biopsychosocial model, and we can see that very easily in standard theory. We can see very easily how that's related to psychodynamics. We can see how there's a biology kind of involved in that, and we can kind of see how the social things, the biopsychosocial thing. That's one I learned about, but it is kind of limited because any problem that you have, you just kind of try to categorize different factors of that problem based on those things. But there are some other kind of drawbacks to it, but otherwise it does a very good job at addressing those problems. Unfortunately, it's somewhat ambiguous. It really does require lots and lots of empirical support and some other things. But it's just one of many attempts to try to make a generalization of how to look at behavior. And there are other emergent theories as well, but standard theory is its own emergent theory. So I find this set of rules to be much more specific, repeatable, effective, and just overall a more inclusive explanation, more specific and deterministic explanation of why people go through that. Instead of saying it's just kind of related to something about our biology, you can say it's related to this metabolite, you can say it's related to this brain, this area of the brain, you can say it's related to neurochemistry in this way, you can say whether or not it's related to hormones and stuff, and then you can do that all the way down to specific characteristic. It's not just kind of a general thing, it's all very deterministic. It trickles down all the way into a specific characteristic or something like that. So, excuse me, anyway, that gives us what we need to address any of the other emergent theories, because we have all these set of rules, and we don't change these rules. It doesn't change regardless of which theory you may happen to be looking at. It's all the same set of rules. So we just run through this very quickly again, and then talk about a couple other things in relation to standard theory versus the other approaches that we have to deal with psychology. So just to run through these again very quickly, behaviorism, to address the whole idea of stimulation and response, and conditioned stimulation and response, we just need the Z0 scale along with memory. In psychodynamics, we just need the different areas of the R scale and the standard and non-standard versions of them. In humanistic, in terms of our nature, we just need those assertions that talk about our tendencies and the goals and those kinds of things. The biologic model, we kind of have that integrated into standard theory by the way it's organized, and by identifying where neurochemistry kind of steps in, and how things like hormones and stuff like that, or our own metabolites and internal stimulation affects that. In social learning, we kind of parallel the different faculties and our different capabilities to the phenomenon that are being observed when looking at the dynamics between people. And in cognitive behavior theory, we just need to be able to understand how to get from our raw environmental experience through intelligence and handling the different communications and things we go through, all the way into the Z scale, which explains something about our behavior and how we respond to all these different things. And that's kind of addressed by how everything is compressed and transmuted, and that gives us a way to resolve those cycles before they become compressed and transmuted. And then finally, there are the emergent theories, which is some adaptation of these other things. Those can depend on these other rules. They depend on these other paradigms, the branches of those paradigms, or their interpretations of them. So in this case, all of these are described by this set of rules. We can use this one set of rules, and we can use a language from standard theory to address each one of the primary things that we have contemporaneously with psychology. So the other way to look at this is thinking about like the strengths of each of these theories, and then kind of their weaknesses as well. And if we want to choose standard theory over any one of these, we kind of want to have a comparable set of strengths with either fewer or no weaknesses, or we want to have a way to address the weaknesses that each one of these has, and hopefully we can do that without changing the rules. So in behaviorism, the strengths are that we have a externally observable system. All we are doing is influencing the system in some way, and then we should see some result. And that's very straightforward. That's one of the reasons that we have our tradition of using empirical study. That's kind of how we apply the scientific method to everything, and kind of one of the reasons that we rely on that in order to observe behavior. So that's one really big strength of behaviorism. Some of the weaknesses is that we don't really have a way to address like relationships with people. We don't have a way to address how we interact with others. We don't have any kind of social aspect of that. We don't really have a way to deal with emotions. We can't really explain why sometimes you shake the cage and they respond one way, and sometimes you shake the cage and nothing happens. We don't really have any tool necessarily to explain that in behaviorism. So standard theory, we can do the same thing that behaviorism does, which is to see what happens when we shake the cage. Not only that, we can explain exactly why it's happening. We can explain how it influences future kind of things, but we also have the entire faculty of intelligence. We also have post-intelligence. We also have neurochemistry and other things like that to tell us why that happens. So we have the same strengths in behaviorism, and then we have the kind of way to address those weaknesses. So in psychodynamics, we can do the same things that psychodynamics does. We can address the different levels of people's internal environments. We can explain why they express themselves sometimes and why they don't. We can explain the interactions between people, and each sort of branch of psychodynamics has its own drawbacks, but fortunately people stuck along with it enough to develop through that. So in the pure psychodynamics, there's not very much in way of how social aspects deal with that. In psychoanalytics, it's not really clear how people deal with that over a long kind of frame of time. And then in psychosocial, many of those things are addressed and it's sort of generalized to what people are going to do kind of in a terminal way. But there are some weaknesses to psychodynamics. We can address all the strengths in standard theory, but some of the weaknesses of psychodynamics deal with the biologic side of things, which is a weakness that many of these have. When psychodynamics started, we didn't understand the brain as well as we do now. We didn't understand necessarily neurotransmitters and those kinds of things. There wasn't a lot in terms of medications and stuff that were being used. In standard theory, we can address all of that. We can address the biologic side of things, we can address the social side of things, and we can not only view or observe those dynamics and those processes that are being explained, but we can also organize them very specifically. We can see how we change through those and why we change through those. So it gives us a little bit deeper explanation. It gives us the biological foundation to all those kinds of things. So using this set of rules, we can have the same kind of strengths we do in psychodynamics, and then we also can address the weaknesses. So we do both of those in that paradigm. So for our humanistic thing, the problem that we have with many of the humanistic kind of things is the idea that it's based on just nature. It's how other people deal with their subjective experiences. And that's one of the biggest struggles that we have in psychology, is trying to match what we're observing with that individual's internal environment. And we kind of have to find a way to say that whatever's happening to you is also happening to them, that if it's explaining what I'm going through, it's also explaining what they're going through, and matching that along with what we're observing just kind of externally in the environment is very difficult to do. It's a very difficult thing to deal with, and that's kind of the conflict between behaviorism and psychodynamics, but we're looking at more of the tendencies and the human nature that evolves from those things. And it's very much focused on just being positive. It's focusing on making things better. It's focused on getting people to that fulfillment. So it's very good in terms of intervening in people's thinking and their thought process rather than just being observant of it or something like that. So that's a very good strength of humanistic kind of ideas. But there are some weaknesses because we don't know specifically kind of like pinpoint why that's happening. You know, we say it's kind of because of this, it's because of that. We want you to do this because it's good for you, or we want you to so on. But it's very difficult to look at the abnormal side of things, which is kind of one weakness of the humanistic sort of paradigm. And once again, there's not really much biologic connection to that. There may not be anything talking about how dopamine influences that. There may not be anything about how hormones influence that. There may not be any kind of hard correlation or hard connection to those things. It may be considered, but in general, we're doing much more subjective things. So even though humanistic is subjective, we don't have, it's not that we don't have, but it's very difficult to sort of pinpoint some of the more scientific things, kind of the hard sciences about it. So using our assertions, we can address all of that subjective kind of stuff, and then along with that, we can view all the biologic things that kind of deal with that, the limits of what we have. We can look at which parts of the brain are involved in that. And furthermore, we can look at how social factors influences that. We can look at which aspects of the environment influence it, and we can see where the problem may be happening. So we can do all the same things we can with humanistic theory using standard theory, and then also we can address those limitations of the biology, the different areas of the brain, the externally observable stuff, and the more objective side of things. So that allows us to address humanism. And then we have the biologic model. And the problem with the biologic model is connecting it to this human nature. So connecting how all these different chemicals and how all these different molecules and how all these different hormones work together to provide us with emotion. How all that works together to provide us with a kind of system of things like politics and organizations and all that stuff. How does all that stuff interact with one another? How does it work when we're just focusing on one person's brain chemistry versus another person's brain chemistry versus brain chemistry in a group versus brain chemistry with medication versus brain chemistry at a certain stage in life and so on. So while the biologic model gives us all of the physical stuff, we don't know how it gets into kind of the non-tangible things. We have yet to really explain directly why we experience emotions and why we have these feelings of this and that, and how that influences our interaction with people. But using the behavioral index, not only can we organize all the biology, we can look at which aspects of our experiences are related to the biology. We can kind of guess which areas of the brain are responsible for doing that. And we can see the limits of what biology has given us. We can see what we would need to have to kind of evolve and become like more intelligent individuals, and so on. So not only are we able to address the anatomy, the metabolism, and the chemistry, we're also able to address the kind of more subjective things that humanism kind of focuses on, like the emotions and all that stuff. So that gives us all the strengths, and then we have a way to address those weaknesses. So social learning, we have the same strengths of social learning. We're describing the same phenomenon. We're seeing the same kind of faculties that people use to learn from one another. And we're seeing that kind of organization of going from kind of the most basic stuff and then over the lifespan developing more and more complex and more more abstract kind of ideas. So that's kind of essentially what social learning is about, is looking at that dynamic between people. But same as these many other ones, we don't have a biological explanation per se. We don't necessarily know why we interact that way, or maybe how it influences our chemistry or those other things. We can use the ideas in the biologic models to describe that, but really integrating them can be kind of difficult. Also, there's not really any intervention involved in social learning. It's all just about observation. It's not really what the next thing is, or whether it's normal or abnormal to go through that kind of way. Those are some of the things that the branches of social learning may address, but it's kind of difficult to say whether or not like behavioral intervention or behavioral change is kind of part of that process. So we have all the same phenomenon that social learning has, but we also have a way to address the biology. We have a way to address the kind of objective sort of behavioral aspects of it, and sort of the behavioral change aspects of it. So we have all the same strengths in social learning, and then we also have a couple ways to deal with the weaknesses. And then moving on to cognitive behavioral theory, we have the same strengths. We have a way to look at which aspects of our experiences are resolved versus unresolved. We have a way to look at how those contribute to our behavior, and we have a way to look at what we can do to make those processes kind of complete themselves so that there isn't a behavioral problem later. So once again, some of the weaknesses are the biologic side of things. We have to look at exactly how serotonin is involved in resolving those cycles, and we have to look at things like how metabolism could influence that. Also, we have to think about people as being part of a system. We have to think about all the social kind of outcomes of just resolving those things for the sake of yourself. We have to think about how it influences our social kind of constructs. We have to think about how that works in groups and so on. And cognitive behavior theory has been adapted in all kinds of different ways. So there may be some branch of it that explains those things, but those are some of the kind of drawbacks that we have, or some of the biologic things, some of the group and social things. And with standard theory, we have the same strengths, and we also have a way to address the weaknesses. So in the emergent theories, I'm kind of on the fence with that, because standard theory is its own emergent theory. So any other theory that you want to use in an emergent sense, the same way that you may integrate like biological with psychodynamics with social or whatever to get to some emergent theory like biopsychosocial model. That's kind of the same thing that standard theory is doing. That's not exactly how it was formulated, but that's essentially what it's doing. We're just taking all these other explanations and all these other ideas and trying to see which ones of them fit together so that we can use it to explain something that's otherwise not yet explained or otherwise doesn't fit really well into these other things. So at that point, you kind of just have to compare and contrast, like which tool is better? Which tool do I use to address this problem? Sometimes you can use something like feminist theory to talk about why social kind of structures or social constructs are sort of harmful, or why they're less important than self-fulfillment and so on. But you also have things like reality and choice theory, which are kind of branches of these other ones. And you can try to figure out why a person does one thing versus another based on what they want or what they need. But once again, those are kind of limited. You're looking at social factors, you're looking at an individual, and you're not really taking the time to step back and look at the whole picture. So with standard theory, we have a set of rules, and part of standard theory is that we can use a set of rules for anything. So that's very different than having an emergence of one area, or having an emergence that's kind of woven into these other things, or just having an emergent theory that deals with several of these. With standard theory, our emergence is that we are addressing everything based on one set of rules that doesn't change. And that's different than feminist theory, where we say the only thing that's important is your self-fulfillment without regard to social constructs and stuff. Those things should limit you. It's different than the biopsychosocial model in thinking of a more deterministic kind of way. So with emergent theories, it's really which one you choose to use, which one has evolved to address the problems you need. The standard theory is its own emergent theory. So we have a way not only to contribute to our emergent theory, but we have a way to compare and contrast which one is more appropriate for the situation. So those all are very popular. All of those are classical theories. All of those are part of what is being taught to people who study psychology and study behavior and those sorts of things. And all of those are described by one set of rules that standard theory provides. So standard theory is compatible with all of these, and then does some more things on top of that. And I'll go ahead and bring those up. I think it's important to talk about all the other things that standard theory can do on top of all this, using the same set of rules. So along with all this, we also have a few other things that we can do. So one of them is memory. Behaviorism does imply some aspect of memory, but these other ones I don't really know if they include memory as part of the explanation as to why people do things. The best thing that I could try to the best way I can try to address how memory is addressed in these other theories is by thinking of trauma or the abnormal stuff or the unresolved things as being related to memory. But standard theory not only deals with memory, but it also deals with the normal memory and the abnormal memory. So that's one thing that standard theory is also able to do is memory, using that same set of rules. Another thing that is kind of a consequence of this is the diagnostic criteria. So we can look at all of the problems that we have in terms of established mental illness. We can look at all of those, not only from a behavior standpoint, from a biologic standpoint, from the different emergent things, the social aspects. We can look at it based on its own criteria, its own set of rules, and then we can look at which factors influence that set of rules. That also gives us our own methodology. We can organize the diseases that we see based on the characteristics they influence. The thing that we use right now for diagnosing illness in psychology is something called the DSM, and that's integrated in something called the ICD-10. And there's also something called the Diagnostic Dictionary. So those are more or less based on symptoms, whereas standard theory is based on some baseline status and then some deviation from that. So not only can we diagnose people, we can categorize and organize the kind of etiology of those problems based on the rules that standard theory gives us. And I'm not sure that it's been really addressed at this point. I know in the book version there's a very kind of brief explanation as to which characteristic is involved with which disease process. So if you have the book version, I think it mentions that like a derangement or an illness of the second characteristic and its terminal form kind of in the disease phase, if there's some problem or abnormal part of the second characteristic, that is indicative of something called physical type bipolar disorder. And the criteria for bipolar disorder has two parts. There's bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 in the DSM. And similarly, there are two types of bipolar disorder that you can recognize using standard theory. One's physical type in standard theory, and the other is social type in standard theory. So we have a way to parallel the different diagnoses to what standard theory is saying. And we can organize those based on three really broad categories, which are essentially intimacy dysfunction, social identity disorder, and then irregular impulse. But that's probably its own video as well. But we can address the whole classification of diseases using just the same set of rules also. And really quickly, you'll see how difficult it is to kind of compare all these different symptoms and all these kind of clusters of stuff, that the time frame versus just using this baseline kind of status versus what the problem may be. So we're able to do that. So the other things that I want to bring up, I know haven't been mentioned in the videos yet. They are mentioned in the book version, but this is a mathematical model. So that was one of the ways that standard theory was formulated. So we can start branching out into other subjects. We can start talking about how the ratios of these work. We can apply a mathematical value to the magnitude of each process. And that was something that was mentioned in the video version, is that we can think about the impulse as having a certain magnitude of about 1/2. In the components of impulse, we can talk about how impulse has a magnitude of about 1/2. We can talk about how the components of subtraction have a magnitude of about 3/2. And then we can talk about how compression has kind of the opposite, like a magnitude of -1/2. And we can just carry that through the entire index. Excuse me. And eventually, once you do all that, you can start addressing and manipulating and modeling all those things based on mathematical values. So that becomes really important for like computing and for modeling and so on. But that's its own kind of interpretation of standard theory. It's called metric psychology. But we can also look at physics of this thing. And that allows us to look at things like speed which is kind of just a measurement of how much is, a magnitude of how much is going on. We can look at things in terms of a velocity, or which direction that stuff is going. We can look at it in terms of acceleration. If we think of each process or each characteristic or each cycle of communication as a vector, we can start looking at what the tendencies and trends are, which deals with things like jerk and stuff like that, which are measurements of combining vectors together. So we can look at the dimensionality of things. We can look at modeling things like free will. We can look at things like modeling things like consciousness. And we can look at the distance that things travel in. And what we find is that most of these are just discontinuous additions of vectors. So we can look at it from a standpoint that allows us to model these things along with or in concordance with the different laws and rules that we see in physics and those types of environments and frameworks. So not only is it doing everything in psychology, we can branch out to math and physics. We can also do chemistry, but it's more of like a biologic thing, I think, than maybe would be a purely chemical kind of thing. We need like biochemistry to explain that, but we can do that as well. We can look at the different aspects of these processes and kind of figure out exactly which concentrations of things we need to do that, and which chemicals are involved in it, and the whole thing with electron transport and all that. But we can apply that to chemistry as well. We also have a way to look at some of the trends and tendencies. So I know this is probably involved in this, but we can look at things like IQ and personality and those kinds of things, emotion, and we can do all that based on STEM psychology. That's kind of like the more fun stuff, I think. So we also have interpretation of standard theory called STEM psychology, and I know that's in the book version as well. It's sort of its own study, but we can look at things like personalities. We can look at something called an intelligence interval. We can look at something called a magnitude of derangement. And it gives us a whole bunch of tools to address all this other stuff. So STEM psychology is also part of that. And then finally, to bring all that stuff together, we have something called metric psychology. I'm sorry, to bring all that stuff together, we have something called executive psychology. So in executive psychology, we're using all these tools to actually create a model of something and to actually predict things and to actually, find out whether or not those rules actually work together, see if all the gears, kind of align and get that whole thing to turn. So those are a few things that standard theory can do, but we can use it to model those ideas, to model emotion, to see exactly how the biology of things work together to get us to that experience of emotion. We can quantify it, and we can use a unit to explain it rather than saying this is what we saw and kind of guess at it. We can say these units are what's causing what we're seeing, and this is the model of proving that that's happening. So in that way, we can sort of make all of these consistent with those rules, and then we can see whether those models work. And it's not until, I don't think it's very easy to do until we have a set of rules like that. So beyond that, there's like empiricism. The problem I have with empiricism deals with empiricism itself. And one of the things in empiricism is that we need to be able to control some aspect of those things in order to be able to get good data on them. You have to have some way, some set of parameters, and so on. And my argument is that behavior and people's experience and all these things have too many variables to really say any one thing about another. And my argument is that until we are able to consider all this stuff in our study or exploration of what's going on, then we don't really have a way to rule out the extraneous stuff. We'll always have some extraneous factor. we will always have some confounding variable. We always have to go through things like kind of ethical procedures and informing people, and just doing that can be enough to change the balance of this. Whereas using this set of rules as your observation, you can do it from a distance. You don't necessarily have to go into a scientific controlled study. You can do it just out in the world. You can do it wherever you need to do. And so long as you obtain your data, or you structure your study based on this, then you should be able to draw some conclusion. And the other thing that goes along with that is using what we found through empirical study to actually apply it to an intervention. And that can be very difficult. So, how do you take all this big data and actually figure out how to intervene in something? It's very difficult to do. Standard theory explains how to do that in the book version using something called the science of organizations. So that gives us another thing that we can do with this that many of these may not be able to address, which are things like law and politics. So we can look at that using super social communication, and we can figure out how that influences people's relationships. We can figure out kind of the ethical side of things as to whether or not those laws are, have any loopholes or anything in there. We can use that to do all kinds of stuff. We can get all the way into forensic psychology and explain, kind of best guess as to why somebody went through something based on these set of rules. We can see exactly, what the normal process should have been, and then what that person did instead. And we can look at that kind of aspect of things. We can apply this to sports psychology. We can apply it in any kind of group of people, in the institution or whatever. And that's explained in the book version through something called the science of organizations. So we can also extend that out into kind of those kind of big societal kind of ideological constructs. So along with all that other stuff, the other thing that we can use to address this kind of is a really kind of throwback, and that's something called the S value. And I think that's worth mentioning. Psychology really, in our current form, really only goes back to mid-1800s, 1850, 1840, somewhere around there. But even before then, back in antiquity, the whole term for psych or psychology was based on like the wings of a butterfly or something like that. And it was a study of the soul at that point. It was kind of that humanistic kind of thing about what makes a person's soul and who they are and how that interacts with the environment and how that interacts with other people. And we can calculate that using all these other tools. We can calculate a value that explains your tendency to all this stuff. I think that's mentioned in the book version, but it's part of STEM and executive psychology. And it's essentially a geometric representation of how much experience you've been through versus how much of that is been resolved. And then you can see how that interacts with other aspects of the world, other facets and other things. So that goes all the way back to like the deep origins of psychology. And that's when people were doing things like enneagrams and looking at people's tendencies and stuff. And back then they thought that there were like 9 different types of a soul that you could have. They're kind of 9 spirits, as it were, and most people would fall into one of those tendencies. But standard theory takes that a little bit further, and we can look into the way that those tendencies interact with one another. We can see how that interacts with ideas and social kind of stuff, but that S value gives us a way to sum all this stuff up into like a interval between 0 and 1. And you say this is the specific number that describes what your soul represents. There are different ways to interpret that, but it's essentially a measure of the number of cycles of communication you go through versus how many of them have been resolved. And you can compare that to the dimensions of a sphere. And the more deformed it is, the lower the S value, and then the more complete it is, the higher the S value. And you can do that between 1 and 0. So that gives us a way to look at all that stuff. So that's the spiritual side of things, but in a completely mathematical sort of way. Yeah, that's essentially what standard theory is able to do. There are more things, I'm sure. Pretty much any time that you have to address the nature of somebody, you have to address their behavior, you have to evaluate something, there's some medical problem you have to look at, or some other mental health, or something like that that you need to address. Standard theory gives you the rules to do all that. So not only can we get through all the classical theories and in psychology, we can branch out to all this other stuff into math and physics and all this other kind of crazy, seemingly abstract things. And we can all do that in a unitized way. We don't have to be subjective with it. We just have to use that set of rules as that foundation. And that essentially gives us a way to address everything else that's been done in psychology up to this point, up until now.